All right, well, welcome everybody to a special Sunday version of Bitcoin Sydney. If for those of you who haven't been to these before, we usually have an evening meetup. It's usually a Wednesday night or something like that, but we've been very privileged to have a special guest with us today who's generously made time in his schedule while he's here for the Singularity conference to come and talk to us about, well, why Bitcoin matters is the fundamental point of it, because one of the major things that distinguishes our meetup beyond most of the meetups that are related to this is our commitment to Bitcoin and Bitcoin only and Bitcoin first, and Bitcoin being the most important blockchain and really the only one that matters. And I think we're in for a real treat this afternoon with what we're going to hear from Alex, because the philosophies that he's going to bring to us today are going to really show why that's the case. Because there is really a strong intellectual foundation towards what has been pejoratively labelled upon us as being Bitcoin maximalism. I mean, we're happy to take that label and run with it, because it's not simply like backing a football team or what sort of religion you happen to be born in. There isn't that sense of arbitrariness to it. There's a real intellectual foundation to it. And I think when we hear from Alex this afternoon, he's going to show us why, give us more information as to why Bitcoin really matters, not only for why it's the most important blockchain, but why it matters for freedom and human rights in the world as well. And it's something that the closed blockchains that seem to get a lot more attention around the place simply cannot do. And in our view as well, if they cannot do that, then they're really not particularly useful, because you could use a database and lots of other technology for doing all those sorts of things if you don't really need the sorts of things that Bitcoin and only Bitcoin can do, with its decentralization, with its trustlessness, with its immutability, and all of the other things that Alex will tell you about, or touch upon anyway, this afternoon. So yes, if you could join me in welcoming to the stage.
Thanks, pleasure to be here. I'm happy we could meet up and hang out here in Sydney. I've never been to Australia before, so looking forward to catching up with you afterwards about that. So I'm a human rights activist, and I had like a career of more than a decade in human rights and civil liberties work around the world, especially focusing on people who live under dictatorships and very repressive regimes. That's like my sort of background, my history, my personal experience is working with people who are dissidents, artists, opposition leaders, protesters, etc., who live under authoritarian regimes. And then in 2016, I started meaningfully thinking about Bitcoin and started to get introduced to the space and started to really see the tremendous revolutionary value it has as a social phenomenon, as a protocol, as a technology, especially to help people who are trapped under very repressive regimes. That's kind of what it pulled me into the space. I came at it from the human rights angle. And what shocked me the most over the last couple of years is just the total ignorance or just blindness or lack of interest shown by the kind of like human rights establishment in Bitcoin. And whether they're libertarian or progressive or whatever, they just don't get it, right? There's just like they haven't looked at it closely yet, but I think they will, right? I think there's some people who like to call these folks pre-coiners, right? Not no-coiners, right? Because they're gonna get it eventually. But right now it's just not there. I mean, when you look at the humanitarian field and you think about how amazingly effective Bitcoin can be as a tool for helping people, there's just nothing there in terms of, they haven't thought about it yet. I mean, one of the most tragic meetings I had was at the World Bank with a bunch of folks, and I walked in and they're like, yeah, we're so excited to use like blockchain to put like identification on blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no, like Bitcoin. And they're like, well, that sounds risky. And I'm like, well, we could save people's lives right now by donating Bitcoin to this particular charity in Venezuela, who then sells it quickly for fiat money and buys food for people who are starving. Will you not work on that with us? And they're like, well, we can't really do that because of X, Y, and Z. So, people are literally dying because of like a closed-mindedness right now, which is really unfortunate. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of education, right? In public education about Bitcoin. So that's why I'm here. I'm speaking at a big conference with a few thousand people on Tuesday called Singularity University, and I have a job with them to talk about, blockchain, governance, etc. But I talk about Bitcoin and the future of money for them. So I'll be doing a talk for them. But today I want to give you sort of a presentation based on what I presented earlier this year at a conference in New York called Magical Crypto Conference, which was a pretty much Bitcoin maximalist mixed with some Monero fun crazy people conference, created by the cartoon characters, Fluffy Pony and Whale Panda and Xelion, etc. So they had me come in and give this talk, and it was a lot of fun, and I'll dive into it with you because I think that financial privacy is critical to human rights in the future. So I think before we talk about like how Bitcoin can help prevent Big Brother or challenge it, we should first identify what is Big Brother, and how does it work, and how can we fight it, and then we can start to understand like why or like is it possible that Bitcoin can be a tool to help, right? So unfortunately, Big Brother is not a figment of somebody's imagination. It's not a Black Mirror episode. It's a real thing, right? So what the Chinese Communist Party figured out before pretty much any other dictatorship was that if you want to actually create what Orwell imagined in real life and implement it, what you need to do is collect as much information as possible from the citizenry, right? And a couple decades ago, this didn't really matter because we didn't have the big data analysis or AI possible to sift through all this information. If you had records about several hundred million people, couldn't really do a whole lot with it. But now, with these algorithms, we can actually sift through this information, and the Chinese Communist Party can like effectively start to like grade and rate and filter through its population in a way that it wasn't able to do before. And that like potential to do social engineering at such a wide scale, I mean, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg now. Yuval Noah Harari talks about how technology favors tyranny, and I agree with him in a lot of ways in terms of big data analysis and AI. I mean, I cannot think of a single argument how AI might improve civil liberties. I just can't. I think it's an authoritarian technology. But thankfully, we have decentralized technology like encryption and Bitcoin and a few others that can help us. But what they figured out in China is that if you can just get everybody to use one app and you can get them to reveal everything about themselves, then you can have a really good idea of their digital footprint and you can start sort of really understanding them and predicting what they're going to do next. And they do that through this app, which I'm sure a lot of you know, called WeChat, which is kind of like a super app, right? That you do everything on it, right? Whether it's shopping or social media communications, etc. This is a quote from someone who lives in Shenzhen who was talking about how they could go to like rural China and pay for snacks and water in a remote village, or they can message a friend or buy train tickets, book hotel rooms, order taxis, share photos with their family. They can pay electricity bills, top up mobile phone accounts, make hospital appointments. They can literally do everything without leaving the app, right? And I think you're going to see other social media companies try to copy this, right? Facebook is obviously trying to do this. I think there's a big difference, morally speaking, between Facebook and WeChat, because Facebook's in the United States and WeChat's in China, but it is something I think you're going to see other social medias try and copy and try to make you kind of like use their app for everything. That way they can create like this amazing digital replica of you, right? And they're kind of innovating in this area, which has been a little bit overhyped, and I'll try and dive into that, but this idea of like social credit. So in Australia or the United States, we have this idea of like credit, which allows us to like get a credit card or get a mortgage or a loan, right? And the favorability of the terms of that agreement is dictated upon our financial history and health and behavior, right? Well, in China, they've started to throw in not just like, have you paid your bill on time, but also like, what is your sexuality or ethnicity or religion? Who are your friends? What have you ever said that might be possibly construed as anti-revolutionary, right? So these things can actually reduce your credit score, right? So what this actually creates is a social phenomenon of self-censorship, basically. Like no one would ever dare dream of saying something on WeChat that could possibly hurt them. Not necessarily because they're afraid of going to prison, but because they're afraid it's going to hurt their ability to buy things and get a fast internet and leave the country and enjoy the riches that basically the Chinese Communist Party will allow you to have if you play by the rules, right? And I think this is something, again, that's going to be starting to be exported to other countries. We just saw the other day that the United Arab Emirates is rolling out its own version. So I think in like 10, 15 years, most authoritarian states and probably a lot of democracies will have something similar. And I think young people in China are wrestling over this. This is a quote from like a 22-year-old young woman in China where she says, whether we're constructing a futurist society or a cage for ourselves, I cannot tell, right? So she started to have to use, or be able to use, WeChat Pay, Alipay for everything, and it's amazingly convenient, right? But then they're starting to realize like what they might be giving up. And there's some pretty extraordinary things you can actually do with this. So this is an experiment done in a city that's larger than Sydney, where when you walk around with WeChat, you look at the app on the, or the map on the app, you can actually see people who are like debtors, who are like bad spenders, basically. And you're basically encouraged to not go near them. So the app turns them into like social pariahs, right? So it really, like, if one of your friends said something bad, or made a mistake, or smoked pot or something, that person's gonna be totally sort of like excommunicated, essentially, scarlet lettered, you know? And this is happening, this social engineering is happening. So this is an experiment, yes, it's not like implemented across all of China, but it's being experimented on in a really large city of 10 million people, right? So this is happening, we're on this march. There's a lot of, I would say, really nonsense media articles about, like, ooh, the social credit thing is overblown. Well, yeah, technically it may be slightly inaccurate, but the intentions are very clear. We should not underrate or underestimate what social credit is and what the Chinese government's trying to do. Like, sure, we can be like realistic about where the technology is, but we should not be like underestimating their power, let's put it that way. And this is being like augmented by advances in facial recognition technology. Now, you've seen like protesters in Hong Kong like destroy, you know, facial recognition towers and wear masks and use laser pointers to confuse facial recognition. And you're starting to see what protest is going to look like in the 21st century as we get deeper into the information and digital age is really protest to try and evade facial recognition. But when, you know, they have police officers in China, and this photo is like a year and a half old, so God knows what they can do now. But when she looks out, she sees something sort of like this, which is an actual demonstration from a Chinese public security company that sells its equipment to like public security firms in China. And you can just see all this information about all these people. So this is like, this sort of big data analysis is starting to be possible with technology. It wasn't possible a few decades ago, but it is now. And when you think about this quote from Orwell, that Big Brother is watching you and that nothing was your own except a few cubic centimeters inside your head, this is literally true for like hundreds of millions of people now. It's certainly true for everybody who lives in northwestern China, in Xinjiang. This is a aerial satellite image of a prison camp in Xinjiang in northwestern China. So this is a traditionally Muslim area where something like 20 million Muslim minority Uyghurs live in northwestern China. It's the largest geographic province of China and very mineral rich. It's obviously very historic. The Silk Road went through Xinjiang, but much like the Chinese government put down and kind of like colonized Tibet, their next ambitious endeavor has been to colonize Xinjiang. And you'll read a lot of like Chinese propaganda, Chinese government propaganda about how, you know, all the Muslims are terrorists and they're bad people and therefore we have to go in and be strong. But no, that's all bullshit basically. I mean, they're putting all these people in prison camps. So what they do is they take the males, they put them in camps like this, and they take the women and they marry them off to Han Chinese women. And then they identify the children as Han. So they're doing a cultural genocide right now, and like nobody cares, literally. So just to give you a numerical comparison, during World War II, the most Jews and Gypsies and handicapped people that the Nazis ever had at one point in camps was about 715,000. These are different kind of camps, they're not death camps yet, but this just gives you an idea. Today, the Chinese Communist Party has more than 1 million Muslims in camps. So this is like happening right now, and it's happening because of this like sort of superpowered centralized technology where the Chinese government is able to like track what everybody is doing, right? They weren't able to do that before. And this is spreading. So this is a map from the New York Times. My friend Melissa Chan does video work for them, and she did this amazing investigation into Ecuador. The country of Ecuador, all the way over here, you know, is buying surveillance equipment from the Chinese government. So all the countries in red have already purchased, you know, public surveillance technology, street-level surveillance technology, financial surveillance technology, etc. So this is part of this like one belt, one road system that the Chinese government is building, and I know that Australia has like wisely forbidden or banned Huawei from like building its 5G networks here, which I think is a really good move.
We banned encryption as well, so...
Yeah, that's horrible. But let's for now. You definitely don't want Huawei building your 5G, let's put it that way. But you can just see that this is like, I mean, even in Europe, even in the heart of Europe, you've got, you know, the United Kingdom bowing down to Xi Jinping and hiring Chinese companies to build the future communications infrastructure of Britain. It's pretty shocking. Same thing with Mexico. If you've ever been to Mexico City recently, you see Chinese advertisements everywhere. And of course, Africa is like, getting colonized again, right? So we're seeing this happen real time, and it's kind of like, I guess you could call it digital colonialism. And it's real, it's big, it's got a budget of about $1 trillion, which in real terms is about 10 times bigger than the Marshall Plan, which is what rebuilt Europe after World War II, right? So the Marshall Plan had a budget of like 150 billion or something in today's dollars, and the Belt and Road has a budget of about $1 trillion. And they've already given out $400 billion in investments and loans across 120 nations. So this makes the Communist Party in China the world's largest creditor, and there are 0 human rights and democracy requirements, right? So obviously, I don't think, like, for example, my government is perfect. However, there's a big difference between like going into the negotiating table with a government and paying lip service to democracy, and what the Chinese do, which is they come in and they say basically, if you say anything about human rights, we're leaving. There's a big difference there. Even if Western governments are like not truthful or they don't actually care about human rights, it's a huge difference from if you mention human rights, we're leaving. So this is kind of what's happening, and surveillance cities are popping up all around the world. You should always know that like this term smart city really just means surveillance city. There's no difference. If we're actually going to make smart cities that protect our human rights and freedom, like they're going to have to be, built with things like encryption, Bitcoin, etc. Not the way they're currently being built. So this is like a shot from inside the police tracking division in Ecuador that my friend took, and they're using this Chinese technology to like start to just like track dissidents. So dissidents, people who are critical against the government, have started to notice like cameras pop up like on their street, things like that. And obviously, if you go to like the poor neighborhoods, there's just not, there's no surveillance. They're not interested in that, right? So this stuff's happening all over the world. But I'd argue that the centralization of data poses threats to us beyond the whole issue of China and Chinese technology. Obviously, even in my country and in other Western countries, we're facing our own sort of struggles with the centralization of information about ourselves, right? So this is a message that I got last year where Facebook helpfully messaged me and said that basically all of my information had been breached in some sort of incident, and we're working closely with law enforcement to address the incident, right? This is what they said. It's not like I was given some sort of, reimbursement of some kind. They were just like helpfully, like we lost everything about you that matters. Sorry. It's like, this is what this says, right? So when we have centralization of information about ourselves with entities, that's going to get hacked, right? If you have all your eggs in one basket, that stuff's going to get hacked. So we look at like Equifax, which is like one of the top 3 largest accrediting agencies in the United States. A year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, they lost sensitive information about 140 million Americans, right? Like social security numbers, everything. So I had to sit there and like fill out all this paperwork to change all my information. So whether you care about, Orwellian surveillance, or you just care about sort of basic sort of cybersecurity, there's a lot of real reasons to kind of want to look at a more decentralized model where everything's not in one place. What was kind of amazing to me, and I'll tell you this short story, is that there's almost like this banality of evil thing with Western governments and companies. I gave a talk about Bitcoin to a bunch of Scandinavian financial and kind of like commercial financial C-level people, right? And after my talk, this banker from Denmark, from Danske Bank, was like, hey, I disagree, I don't think we know enough about our clients. And I asked her, like, what would be the creepy line? Like, what would be too much? Where would you be like uncomfortable knowing too much about your clients? She couldn't answer me, right? So they have this like thirst for your data and information, even in democracies and free societies. And it's considered normal. I'm sure she's a good person, right? This is why it's like the banality of evil, right? So there's this like corporate governmental mindset. It's sort of like, I guess sort of, I don't know, nanny state's the wrong word, but like, they just think it's like really morally good to know as much about you so they can protect you, right? And this is a really dangerous trend that's happening, again, even in like free societies. You're seeing it here, obviously, in Australia, where there are people who want to ban encryption, right? They want to be able to be there for you. They want to be there as a third party in your little encrypted chat, right? Just to make sure everything's okay, right? So there's this question like, is this like Orwellian police state necessary to fight bad guys? And like, I think the answer is definitely no. there's a really good book called The Looming Tower, which was written by Lawrence Wright, who won the Pulitzer, I believe, for this work of nonfiction which describes the life stories of two people, Osama bin Laden and a guy named, I think, John O'Reilly, who was an FBI agent who spent his life tracking bin Laden. And what's abundantly clear from the book is that the reason we didn't catch bin Laden before 9/11 wasn't because we didn't know where he was, or we didn't have enough information about American citizens. It's because like the CIA and FBI and the military like weren't sharing effectively. They weren't like communicating properly with each other. It wasn't that we didn't have enough surveillance, you know. So I just think that this argument is sort of bullshit that like we need to give up all our rights to protect, you know, our country. And I think it's a sort of a dangerous one that obviously all of us are grappling with, especially in China, where that argument really curries a lot of favor with the population at large, and it's very popular. If you were to actually do a poll in China, a real poll, people would vote for national security for sure over privacy, right? I mean, maybe in a country like Germany they wouldn't, but in most countries it's not looking so good. So again, I've described a bunch of different trends and reasons for why these like Big Brother type systems are manifesting, but basically they are, both in open and closed societies. And you know, they seek to capture your digital footprint, trace your daily micro activity, that's the important part, like you going to Starbucks, dropping your kids off to school, etc. That's the real money, is understanding your intricate micro activities. And then they sort of start to steer you becoming loyal and patriotic. That's like the goal. Now the key part, and the reason why like Bitcoin is so interesting to me in this area, is that the less information we leave behind about ourselves, the harder it is for Big Brother to work, right? The harder it is for it to grow. So this is a guy named Jaron Lanier. He's actually the guy who came up with the term virtual reality in the 1980s. And he's given this TED Talk last year where I feel like the ending should be like, hey, what about Bitcoin? He just doesn't get that far, but he basically talks about how dangerous it is that our current internet infrastructure is like highly centralizing, right? And putting all the power in a small handful of companies and governments. And I think the lesson from what he says is that like, if you could control your data and money, I don't think I need this, I think it's fine, then that would make total government surveillance impossible, right? So it's an important lesson, and something that I think we can like look at the Bitcoin protocol and what's possible to build on top of it to kind of make it a tool for us, right? So there's a great quote from Yuval Noah Harari, again, the author of Sapiens. He says, if you dislike the idea of living in a digital dictatorship, then the most important contribution you can make is to find ways to prevent too much data from being concentrated in too few hands. They won't be easy tasks, but achieving them may be the best safeguard of our democracy, right? So, you know, again, Yuval Noah Harari, I don't think really understands Bitcoin yet. But I think if I could sit in a room and we could all talk to him, I bet he would start to, you know, think meaningfully about it. But I think what he says here is definitely true, and especially we can start on the sort of financial area, because, you know, the cashless world for a lot of people is already here. It's not just coming, right? So only 8% of daily transactions around the world are estimated to be done with paper or metal. So most of the money making and money transactions and payments around the world, they are all electronic already, right? So there's all these big risks with centralized data. And with centralized money, we see a lot of the same things, right? So if you're relying on a third party to send your payment, you can have malicious intermediaries, you can have surveillance and a loss of privacy. Obviously, as I've just shown, you can have social engineering, and then you can even have easy wealth confiscation, right? So these are all, I think, really negative things that come with kind of the centralization of digital money. Ben Hunt, who writes a really great, he's not like super into Bitcoin, but he's pretty good on most things. He writes a very good Wall Street blog called Epsilon Theory, and I was interviewed for it. But recently he wrote this, and I think it's true. Using government-approved electronic money will be the water in which you and your children swim. You will not be able to imagine a world where a censorship-embracing coin is not everywhere. So if Bitcoin fails, this is definitely the future, right? I think we all know that, right? So, and if you're going to make like a bet on it, it seems like that would be a pretty smart bet, right? And we all have to think about, obviously you all, you know, being in the Bitcoin community, you've already thought about this, but I think the average person needs to think about what kind of cashless society do they want to live in. Like, do I want to use Bitcoin and Lightning to be able to buy something and then not have that meaningfully connected to my digital footprint and not be spied on? Or do I want like the government and all these companies to see that I've done that, right? These are the two possibilities, and I think we need to fight really hard for the former. And it really goes to the heart of like why decentralization matters, generally speaking. So I think that Bitcoin's like the third great revolution in decentralization. The first one was in politics itself. The humans invented this tool of democracy, because we all used to live under a centralized society where all these powers, whether it be the power of creating information, the power of creating money, the power of regulating communications and speech, the power of laws, courts, military, etc., was all controlled by one entity, right? For obviously most of human history. Starting in ancient Greece and then iterating over the last 2 millennia, we've had this idea of a decentralized society where there are checks and balances, and this is what makes free societies possible. Not voting, but separation of powers, right? Where you have the courts, which are separate and independent from the executive branch, which is separate and independent from the independent media, which is separate and independent from the legislature. These things are really, really important. So I would argue that democracy was this like first tool that humans used to decentralize society. The second one, I would argue, is information. You have the printing press and all the different technology advancements that came after it, leading up to the telegram and then later the internet, right? So now, both the means of production of information and the way to access information have been really democratized. And this is evident in the fact that like anyone can start a podcast now, like anyone can get their voice out. Yes, it comes with its own like set of problems, but this I think has been like really progressive for humanity, that like billions of people now can have all the world's information in their pocket. Whereas several thousand years ago, you had to go to like the Library of Alexandria, right? This is like a really progressive democratizing trend. So I think the third frontier is money. And the decentralization of money through Bitcoin, I think, will have similarly positive effects for humanity, although those effects will also be like really hard to predict. But when it comes to freedom and privacy, Orwell gave us some of these general ideas, but I like this quote from the Black Swan author, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, about how Bitcoin's mere existence gives us the crowd an insurance policy and against an Orwellian future. And I don't even know if he really understood what he said when he made this statement, but I love playing with it because I think it's really true. If you think about this possibility that Satoshi, gave us, where we can go off the beaten path and get off of this evolution of money, which ends in this slippery slope of basically WeChat. This gives us another way out. This gives us a way to do payments digitally without someone in the middle, right? So, and I talked through these like concepts, but this idea that we can send and receive money in a way that's unstoppable with no censorship and no CEO is just so powerful. And I know you guys get it, but it's astonishing to me that like it's not like more widely talked about. I mean, every other way that we have to send money on the internet goes through somebody, whether it's PayPal or Visa or MasterCard, and yet now we have Bitcoin, which is just this incredible thing where you don't even need a bank account to send someone Bitcoin or receive Bitcoin, right? So this is like this the human rights aspect of it that I find so compelling. Here are just some general thoughts on this idea of the human aspect of it. Less than 1% of humans have ever used Bitcoin, but more than 4 billion people live under authoritarianism. And nearly 2 billion people don't have a bank account or an official state ID. So as more and more people learn about Bitcoin, and again, the education piece is key, the book, the Little Bitcoin book, which I wrote with Jimmy Song and some other Bitcoiners recently, is now in Spanish and is being published in 10 languages in the next 6 months. And our goal is to really just like seed that out there. I mean, we're getting it, it's almost translated in Chinese. Davi Wan is doing that for us. And once we get that translated, I'm gonna have it into my networks and it's gonna be disseminated across China. It's going into Korean. We're gonna smuggle it into North Korea on flash drives. It's gonna be great. So we're gonna get the word out, right? So we're gonna do our best to sort of like spread the general word about Bitcoin. I think that's really important because once people realize that they don't need a bank account, they don't have to ask their government's information to receive money, to earn money. I think that's going to be, quite a radical concept. And, again, we can argue about these terms, but generally speaking, 4 billion people live in a society that's like highly centralized and where the control over money is like very, very centralized. So in the United States even, you would argue that a small group of people control the monetary policy. And while that's true, in the countries in red, it's much more than that. Like the dictator literally can just say, let's just print more money. Like in America, we at least have like a tension between the Fed and the president, right? In Turkey, Erdogan literally will just say, oh, we're going to shut off the foreign exchange stuff today. And you know, the vice president of Turkey was caught with a money printing machine in his basement. I mean, that's like the craziest scandal that happened like 4 years ago. Nobody seems to care. Like if the American vice president was caught printing money in his basement or her basement, that would be, I think, front page news. But this is just de facto the way things are in these unfortunate countries which are really, really centralized, right? So this is a huge issue. And I think what's really important with Bitcoin is that some of these human rights issues can be really challenged. I mean, you know, when China, we talk about how Xi Jinping and the Communist Party has started to have this ability to micro-track everything you're doing, well, if you're using Bitcoin, that's not so easy for them. And what's weird is that they haven't even started cracking down on Bitcoin meaningfully. Bitcoin is digitally protected property in China today. And literally, people use it, they use WeChat, ironically, to like do OTC trades, right? So if I sent somebody using a non-KYC wallet half a Bitcoin right now in Beijing, they can turn that into fiat currency super fast. And they do it on ironically on a WeChat group. But it's creating this parallel economy that Xi Jinping cannot control. And what Putin does when he wants to shut down human rights groups, what do you think is the first thing he wants to do when he wants to shut down a human rights group or an independent media organization? He closes their bank account. Well, guess what? You can't close their Bitcoin account, right? The dictatorship in Burma is trying to basically like delete this entire Muslim population, the Rohingya, right? So, you know, they start by taking away their financial rights and their property rights. Well, they can't delete their access to Bitcoin, right? Same thing with even my government. So my government's sanctioning the country of Iran, right? So young men and women in Iran who didn't even elect their government are now being punished for this, right? So, you know, what did the average 23-year-old young woman in Tehran do? She didn't do anything wrong. She can't even vote for her government. So why shouldn't she be able to buy an iPhone, right? Well, now she can. She can make money from abroad and she can buy things using Bitcoin. And then in Venezuela, we've seen like the most cruel kind of version of financial repression, which is hyperinflation. So I have, my organization was started by a Venezuelan. I've been working on Venezuelan civil liberties issues since 2007, and I've seen just like the utter collapse of this society to the point where, you know, the money system has been so exploited by the government where they, you know, will print extra money just to fund themselves and keep themselves alive and just destroy the savings of the average person, vaporize it. So in 2016, a cup of coffee cost 450 bolivars in Caracas. In 2017, it was 4,500. Last year, it was 1.4 million. So what you're watching is just like the vaporization of savings of like lower and middle class people. If you're rich in Venezuela, you can do some interesting things. Until really recently, like a couple of months ago, the bank in Venezuela was giving out loans denominated in bolivars. So rich people would like take out a loan and then immediately buy an apartment in like Miami, and then just watch as their loan disappeared. So it like really benefited the rich. There's this like Cantillon effect, right? That a banker in England several hundred years ago described, where the printing of money really affects the elite and helps them at the expense of everybody else. This is like the most dramatic version of that, right? So I guess like, you know, again, for like most laymen and like no coiners or pre-coiners, like their money system might work really well, but again, most people around the world don't have that luxury. There's billions of people who suffer from whether it's dictatorship or withdrawal limits or sanctions, hyperinflation. I mean, you can look at Argentina for like another really clear recent example. I love this idea that you don't need an ID to use Bitcoin. There's so much discussion about decentralized identity and how the blockchain is going to like save us in some way. And I think what this entire conversation misses is the fact that the whole idea is to like not have an identity. Like I don't want a big centralized identity with all my stuff on it. I want to be able to pick and choose what other people see, right? And that I think is like something that's so important about Bitcoin. And to have that right, I don't need to ask anyone for permission. Like all you need is an internet access and a smartphone. Apparently by the end of next year, 6 billion people will have smartphones around the world. And there's fast liquidity. Everywhere from Nigeria to Venezuela to China, Philippines, Iran. In less than an hour, I can send you Bitcoin and you can convert it into local fiat money. And that's like such a critical part of this. If you don't have that network effect, if you don't have that ability, right now, we have to be honest, if you can't turn your Bitcoin into local money, for most people who aren't just trying to accumulate Bitcoin, it's useless. Like you can't do anything with it. But guess what? it is not useless. It's very useful, and it's useful in a lot of places. And the most beautiful part, again, is that you're not creating this massive digital footprint with all your transactions while you're doing this. I like to show this slide to folks because I have a friend who was in the Indian telecom industry in 1994. And he, at that time, he told me that, nobody thought that everybody in India would own a phone. They thought it would be completely impossible, right? But guess what? Over 20 years, technology improves, things shrink, get more powerful. So right now, we're over here with Bitcoin user technology. It's kind of clunky, not many people know about it. It might be expensive or slow or whatever, but we got the next 2 decades to improve this, right? And I think we're gonna be over there faster than you think. We cover this in our book, but all these concepts were dismissed. There's a great Twitter account that just reprints articles showing about how the car will never work on our horse roads, and the airplane is too dangerous to ever fly, and the telephone, big companies refused to buy the patent for it because they didn't think it was useful or interesting. The internet, of course, there's many famous stories about how it would never work. So Bitcoin, as you all know, is going to be dismissed, but I think the best advice for other folks is just to be open-minded. And I like showing this image as just this undeniable paradigm shift that's happening. So in Venezuela, first of all, there is almost something out of a sci-fi book where the volume of money traded every day denominated in US dollars on local Bitcoins, one website, is now higher than the amount of bolivars denominated in dollars traded on the Caracas Stock Exchange. And I know it's an extreme example, but you know what? Venezuela is not a small thing. It's a country of 30 million people, right? So we've already stepped into the void when it comes to literally Bitcoin challenging, current money systems. And what is so amazing is that government, which has so destroyed its currency through just greed and cruelty and control, has tried to prevent aid from coming in to help its citizens. So this is an image that New York Times and many other news outlets circulated back in February of this year, right? And it showed basically an attempt by the government to shut down a highway and prevent aid from coming in to the country. And what you don't see in the image is all the millions of Bitcoin going back and forth, right? So this idea that governments can can control and regulate the flow of information is going to go in the dustbin of history. Obviously, we know that. If you understand Bitcoin, you realize that governments will no longer be able to do this effectively. And that's just got to be really exciting. So I think that Bitcoin, especially when paired with something like Lightning, and I know Lightning's not, development and adoption is not going as fast as I'd like it to go. But, people are chipping away, and brilliant mathematicians and scientists are working on it. Obviously, if you follow Stefan's show, you'll hear interviews with them, and they're doing some amazing things with ambitious projects to get more channels out there and better tech out there. And I think that if we can start meaningfully doing this, I have a friend named Will who started a company called Fold, and what you can now do in America, at least and probably do it in most places, but you can use his app to use Lightning to buy stuff at Whole Foods and Starbucks, right? And it's done through a loophole where your Lightning is buying just a gift card, but it's kind of the first step, right? And you can meaningfully start just doing all your daily stuff at the market and at the coffee shop without being spied on. And that's really cool, right? And you can do it already with this. And I think we're at a really rudimentary step, but we can start seeing that if we use this system, if we opt out of the current system, we move into this one, we can move into a world where we can transact and communicate in a way that's just much less restricted and much less surveilled on. And I think it's really important that we pursue this vision of decentralization with Bitcoin kind of as the kind of, I guess, the roadmap. Because if we don't, we know that centralization is really bad for humans. Obviously, we've talked at length about what's happening in China, but I guess one of the best examples of how centralization as a general concept is bad for humanity is this nighttime satellite image of the Korean peninsula, where all these people used to be equal. They all lived under Japanese occupation. But after World War II, there was a communist dictatorship set up in the north, which centralized absolutely everything, literally around this one point of light, which is Pyongyang. It's like the Hunger Games. So they all lived in the capital. Everybody else lived in District 12, right? And it was all done through a caste system, depending on where your family came from. But literally, you know, this is what a centralized system looks like. It's like basically decent for all the rich people who are in the Communist Party. And when I say decent, like their apartments are still not that impressive. Like they have like a really lower middle class standard quality of life, unless you're in like the dictatorship government family itself, right? Everybody else is fucked, right? And then in South Korea, like this is a country that has given us so much, whether it's the technology in our pockets or incredible innovations in televisions, cars, etc. But it's the same people, these same people. This is the decentralized society, and this is the centralized society. And I think there's just nothing that just like connotes why it's so important for us to keep this idea alive in this like very bright image. So I usually like to end with these questions that kind of align three themes of the talk that you know, we have different ways of governing ourselves out here in the real space. You know, and is the future of our governments around the world going to be tyranny or democracy? Is the future of knowledge going to be state control of information and propaganda, or is it going to be the open internet? And is the future of money going to be WeChat or Bitcoin? But I think the cool part is that's up to you guys. So thanks for having me.
Wow. Thanks very much, Alex. That's amazing. I think there's plenty of material there that we can all use to take from there and preach Bitcoin, as it were. Our Friar Hass has been very much on that in that vein in preaching Bitcoin, and I think from that sort of material there, it really strikes at the nub of why this stuff's important and its true impact on the world. Now, I hope you've all been thinking up some great questions for Alex, as I'm sure he'd love to. I think you've got, how long have you got, Alex, before you've got to get going?
Yeah, like 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay.
20 minutes of Q&A, or we can just hang out.
Or hang out, whatever. I mean, we're a small enough group, so we can, however you want to do it. So we've got it. Is this a question right up, ready to go?
Let's do it.
You're not going to get into a war of words, but I think you wasn't that educated on the topic, and a lot of people could have got damaged financially, spiritually, emotionally. So what do you think about LeBron James and this whole fucking NBA conference?
Oh, right.
Because that's literally what he said. He's like, I'm not going to get into a war of words with the coach, but he was uneducated and China's all right, and we could have got damaged financially.
Yeah, I mean, not a Bitcoin thing, but I think an important thing. I think, look, you cannot assume, you can't assume that the companies that are in our societies are going to choose like morals over money. They're just not, right? And LeBron James, it's like the height of hypocrisy because he's seen as this like social justice icon.
Not just that, the first word he mentioned was people could have got damaged financially. He didn't mention anything about
something that I've observed pretty keenly.
Would you like to take a seat?
No, it's cool. Is that is this issue of empathy? And you know, I'm out there trying to raise money to help people in like these faraway countries, and it's really hard to convince Americans that like they matter, right? And I think you see this played out in the LeBron thing. Or we have this program at my charity, the Human Rights Foundation, where we try and convince celebrities not to go sing for dictators. We're very into like non-violent, creative, peaceful ways to challenge like repression. And one very good way to do that is to like punish dictators by like saying, no, you're not going to get to have Nicki Minaj or LeBron James until you clean up your act, right? So we successfully got Nicki Minaj to not go to Saudi Arabia this summer. And it was a huge thing. And MBS, who rules Saudi Arabia, he can have pretty much whatever he wants, but he can't have Nicki Minaj. And I can guarantee you he's super pissed off about that. But you know what? That's a victory. Same thing with Putin and Xi Jinping. What do they want at the end of the day? They want to like send their kids to Harvard and own land in Europe, but we can take that away from them, right? And we can do it peacefully. We don't need war to do this, right? So I think like the cultural soft power thing is really important. I was at the Apartheid Museum in South Africa a couple of years ago, and there's this room which is so moving, which just shows how the world came together, like across like pop culture, Sting and Bono, and like the Olympics kicked out the apartheid regime, and like everybody came together and said like, no, this is bad. And it's just amazing to see how spineless the world has become. Why should North Korea be able to compete in the Olympics? It's fucking insane. They literally punish the coaches. They send them to like the salt mines if they come back. So we need like institutions like the NBA and the Olympics, and institutions that we can pressure as citizens. Like we can pressure them, and we can get them to change. I've gotten into some like really intense arguments with Bitcoiners on Twitter about like the importance of like protest and dissent. And a lot of them are just like, no, we only have to build technology. This other stuff's useless. And I'm like, I can tell you that's wrong. Like I've seen the world change in the last 100 years because of peaceful protest. So many countries have toppled their dictators because of this. So it's really important that we do both. We have to have advocacy. We have to pressure LeBron James to like do the right thing. And I think we, at least Americans, can do that. And we also have to build awesome cyberpunk technology that does what we want it to do. Yeah. Yeah.
So Bitcoin mainly depends upon the internet. And
Yes.
the internet goes out. So
Yeah.
how then we can be dependent on Bitcoin? For example, in Kashmir, the internet has been out for more than 2 months now. So people
Yeah.
who have been mining Bitcoins or trying to buy things, they would have to go out of Kashmir, then convert it to money, and coming back to the area would again be difficult for them because that is all real
Or a technical solution, which I think.
So how can we, because internet is still centralized by the authorities.
Yeah, so definitely a real problem. However, I think that in like the 30 years from now, I know it's not helpful for us now,
I think 30 months.
but you know, I've been watching this because my organization smuggles stuff into North Korea. It's something we have. It's called a program called Flash Drives for Freedom. And over the last decade, we've been like working with people who are like shrinking the size of a satellite internet receiver. So now they can shrink it so small that it goes into the bottom of a pack of cigarettes, which is how you would smuggle it into North Korea. I think that, God, I mean, maybe it's less than 30 years, but maybe in 10 years, the average cost and size of a satellite internet receive-send device is going to be so frickin' tiny and cheap that it's going to be impossible for governments to prevent people from going on the internet.
Well, right now there's the Blockstream satellite project.
Yeah.
You know,
That's why I
the-
say
the-
30 months, not
Yeah, and like,
Yes.
like the Blockstream project, yeah, but to use the Blockstream,
it's not simple.
you still
but
need to be
yeah.
very DIY and make your you can use
Yeah.
Raspberry Pi. I mean,
Yeah.
I've seen like, so people can like, what I would do if I were a philanthropist is I would buy 100,000 Raspberry Pi things and frickin' just send them into Kashmir to Bitcoiners. Like, you can like literally solve this problem right now. I'm just saying, I think in the near future, we're going to live in a world where SpaceX and Facebook and all these private companies are going to have their own satellite internet networks, and people will have choice. Now, they all won't be equal, and some of them will be bad, and they'll spy on you, but at least you won't be like restricted to just your government internet. You will have options. So I think that that's like the world we're moving into. So I'm pretty optimistic about where actually the tech's going in that direction. So, I mean, even today, my friends in the Philippines, like when they boot up their phone, it automatically switches to like Facebook's internet, which is free. Now, obviously, that's not like super ideal, but it's the beginning of like the decentralization of internet access. Like, I think there'll be many companies that do that in the future, or at least like a handful of really big ones.
It was put to me by, let's say, it's a blockchain person, we'll say that, who was not a believer in Bitcoin. He was a believer in blockchain and other forms of tokenization and things like this. But he was anti-Bitcoin because he thought that, well, the government, if it just gets too big, the government's just going to shut it down or ban it or whatever other variation on that word you want to use. Now, given the threat that Bitcoin poses, as you said in your presentation, to its many governments' authoritarian aims.
Yeah.
What would that really take for that to be successful? I mean, is it even remotely possible?
What we need to do is the following. We need to look at what China does. So China's the world's largest, well, first of all, largest country, but also largest police state. So if they ban possession of Bitcoin, we're going to watch it happen in real time, what happens. But you know what? They're not. It's actually legally protected property. And no one knows why, but my thesis would be a couple things. Number one, if they try to ban possession of Bitcoin, they will look weak because they won't be able to enforce it, and they don't want to look weak, right? Number two, already Chinese Communist Party officials use Bitcoin to move their money abroad and evade the $50,000, like, you know, renminbi to dollar limit that's placed on citizens in China. So that would be unfortunate for them, right? So I think there's different reasons, but today in China, Bitcoin is legally protected property. Yeah, it's illegal to do an ICO or like do trading, but you can own it. Now, as soon as, let's say I don't think, there's a very good chance they never ban it. But if they do ban it, we're going to watch what happens in real time, right? I think banning possession of Bitcoin, if your government or my government does it, will be about as effective as the drug war, meaning terribly ineffective, and will lead to a lot of death and destruction. But they might do it. They were stupid enough to ban marijuana in the United States, which has caused, I mean, the reason we have this horrific prison, one of the reasons we have this horrific prison issue in the United States is that we have all these like people in prison for nonviolent drug crimes for possessing or smoking a plant. I mean, it's insane. But I mean, don't put it past governments to do that. But what I would just say is like, let's look at China as like a canary in the coal mine thing. And until they ban Bitcoin possession of it, I mean, we don't really need to worry about that, you know? Yeah.
I mean, like, there's a big reckoning coming. Big tech doesn't like Bitcoin. Government doesn't like Bitcoin. So, how would they try to control it? Like, how would the US try to control it?
Yeah, so my organization has done some research in in India, which obviously, I think India is the most anti-crypto government in the world, right? Or anti-Bitcoin government in the world. Very pro-blockchain, but really anti-Bitcoin. So I think that my friend just sent me some pictures she sent me of a bank in India. And you walk into the bank and it's got what I can only describe as very similar to like when you buy a pack of cigarettes here, it's got like death on it, right? Like charred lungs and stuff. So you walk into this bank in India and it's basically like Bitcoin will like kill you, it's dangerous, like all these huge posters. So there's a propaganda campaign against Bitcoin in India, and people have been arrested for running exchanges and things like that. But you know what? I think that's only going to drive interest and price up, you know? Like any black market. Like if you really try to prevent people from using this thing, it's only going to increase people's interest and the price ultimately. Like if they're really successful in like making it really difficult to get Bitcoin in India, there will be a premium on the price, right? And then, okay, people will figure out ways to get in there and make money. So there's interesting game theory behind Bitcoin that I think is very unfavorable for governments that want to like control it. And even more so than that, if you create an environment that is restrictive for Bitcoin, other governments will benefit, right? So the entrepreneurs and the miners and the coders will go elsewhere to more favorable places. And they'll take a lot of human talent with them. There'll be a lot of brain drain. So it would be like a really dumb move for governments to be draconian when they could be like the Silicon Valley for Bitcoin, right? So we're gonna have to just see how this plays out. But I don't see a scenario where like all governments in the world try to like ban Bitcoin.
They have to do it simultaneously.
Yeah, there's gonna be like 10 governments that are like, nope,
No,
you
yeah,
can't come here.
But they have done it before. I remember basically the UN single treaty on drug policy. They basically said if you don't apply the policy, we are declaring war on the country.
Yeah, but then countries like Portugal were like, screw this, we're gonna legalize. So it's these are all experiments. We'll have to see.
But they were put under a lot of pressure when they legalized. And their answer was, you want to talk shit to us, go talk shit to Colorado and Washington.
Well, I think...
And then the America had to shut up because Colorado and Washington were legal.
I mean, the drug policy thing is a tragedy, but at the same time, it's kind of inspiring. Like, honestly, if you had asked me 20 years ago, like, would I be able to just go buy pot in America easily? I would have said no. And today, it's like amazing. In my city, we have huge billboards saying like, use this app to buy pot, right? So the transition and like the speed at which even a conservative country like America has shifted towards like legalization of what was considered like a horrible thing is kind of inspiring. Like, I mean, that you know, if we go down the wrong road with Bitcoin, like, we could see a reversal fairly quickly, I guess. Yeah.
Just going to your comment around how you said that the Lightning Network wasn't being adopted as quickly as you had expected before.
Yeah.
Any thoughts around?
Yeah, just the apps are really hard to use, man. Like, I have this Breeze one. It's just like tried like 7 times with my friend to like get it working. Like, it's just not quite there yet. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think within like 6 to 12 months, it's going to be there, right?
Okay.
So
it's insanely private, more private than on-chain.
yeah, there is no like you're just not on chain, right? So how are you gonna? You'd have to like somehow hijack the Tor-like network to. No, it's not possible. So it's very exciting, but it's an experiment. You know, even the most hardcore supporters, who are all gathered in Berlin right now, right, will say like, don't try and put more than a certain amount in a channel, etc. But again, I think that like give it a couple of years. Like, this is technology that takes a long time to develop, but it's still pretty promising, I would say. And we need it. We need this like private second layer payment system on top of the main chain. I think it's pretty vital from a privacy point of view. Yeah.
You know how you mentioned Venezuela, right? You're deeply involved with it. If you sent Bitcoin to Venezuela and the locals, then obviously they can't buy anything with the Bitcoin, so they have to convert it back to local currency.
Yeah.
But Venezuela, the guy in the basement can print whatever he wants, right? So the
government can print local.
That's right. So is there a risk that, because we don't know what the government's doing, that it will reverse corrupt the value of the Bitcoin back the other way?
I mean, this is a weird area for me. Governments are really dumb, and if they were smart, they would be mining Bitcoin. Now, they're not, for a variety of reasons, which I think we're probably thankful for, because at this point, 18 of the 21 million have been spoken for, mainly not by governments. But you know what, the Venezuelan government has started to figure it out, and I think they do have some amount of Bitcoin. It's unclear how much. I mean, I don't think Maduro understands Bitcoin. I think, generally speaking, they're probably more afraid of it than not. because even if they wisen up, let's say the North Koreans, the Venezuelans, they realize, oh shit, we should be mining Bitcoin and accumulating it. They don't have a very low time preference, meaning their time preference is like surviving for the next 60 days. So they tend to convert it into fiat and sell it right away, which is good for the rest of us, right? Drives up the price. But at the end of the day, and I had to answer this question about North Korea, yeah, like maybe short-term Bitcoin benefits the North Korean government because they can figure out a way to mine it and use their monopoly over the energy resources in their country to do this, but long-term, it will destroy their ability to have a monopoly over money in their country, and it'll lead to their downfall. So I think like long-term, it's just no good for any dictatorship. One of the things we talk about in the book, the Little Bitcoin book, is that one of our predictions is that it's going to become like really costly and a lot more rare to have like an extremely authoritarian government because of the fact that they won't be able to control the money supply as much anymore. So that's just a thought of ours. Maybe it's too optimistic. But.
So you don't think maybe Bitcoin, as it develops, you don't think it might be in risk of turning into like a caste system where if we knew that Bitcoin came from Venezuela, it may not be worth as much.
I was discussing this with someone right beforehand.
Yeah.
Look, we would start to see this happen. Today there is like fungibility, meaning there's no like market where I can go buy cheaper Bitcoins. At least, does anyone know of cheap Bitcoins I can have for like 50% off? No, even the ones...
Yeah, but you can have more expensive Bitcoins.
You can have more expensive ones, but like there's a... Meaning like, even the ones the US government has like banned these addresses, those people then they sell to somebody else who doesn't care about the US government. So there's been no like... there's no market for like tainted coins yet. Now maybe there will be, I guess, right? But we, you know, it's hard to know. I don't know. I guess we have to be Bayesian here about our I think it's important to be Bayesian, meaning like change our decisions and our perspectives based on evidence. But for now, I haven't seen that, right? And the privacy thing too, we have to be Bayesian about like, yeah, clearly like Bitcoin's not private enough right now. But we have to understand that like beyond Europe and America, pretty much, like governments don't use chain analysis. So that's why it's a really important tool for people who live under dictatorships. Like the Venezuelan government's not using chain analysis on small transactions. They're just not. So I think this is an important thing for us to recognize and take advantage of, right? And I know the Monero people want us to use Monero because Bitcoin's not private enough, but the problem with that is no one will accept Monero. And
Well, will it work at scale, Monero, as well? Whereas Bitcoin is
kind of jerky.
It gets privacy by, well, these guys take it seriously though. The Monero
Yeah, I
guys
think
don't.
look, I want to be like, I think it's great that people are working on other privacy coins, even if I don't believe in like the like long-term usability of actual money, because it'll like force Bitcoiners to become more interested in privacy, which I think is really important. And whether you care about like, let's say you just care about like limiting this, like basically the auditability of the supply, right? The fungibility piece is really important. The fungibility is tied to privacy, right? So we have to make sure that there is privacy in Bitcoin for both sort of like kind of, I would say, economic reasons and for human reasons, right? So maybe that's one thing we can pull out of here. Yeah.
Where do you strike that balance though, where people, let's say, oh, we need a certain amount of surveillance for counterterrorism and things like that? Where does, you know what I mean?
Right, so my prediction would be that let's say in a Bitcoin world where we use like Lightning to buy things in the far future, that the crime rate will be pretty similar to today. Like today we have this ability to like track everybody's money and the flows of their money, whereas 30 years ago we obviously didn't, right? Because people used cash primarily, which is not traceable, obviously. So, and crime rates have like not, if anything, they've gone down in some countries, right? Or they've gone up in other countries. It seems like unclear that there's a link. My prediction would be that in a world where like we can't micro track people's daily lives, that like crime rate would basically stay the same. Like I'm not convinced that like more surveillance will lead to like less crime. And also like we have to, what is crime? Like, I always get these questions from bankers. I'm like, well, almost all financial crime is done by you guys. Like, if you actually look at it, governments and banks commit virtually all corruption, right? Not like the guy down the street, So, and that's a tough thing to kind of like start to understand, but it's just true. And the bankers actually admit it. I did this conversation with a bunch of bankers recently, and the guy from Santander in Spain was like, oh, Bitcoin's used for all this money laundering, like, we don't like it for these reasons. And he's like, but I was like, but you guys do all the money laundering. And he said, no, we don't do any. And then his Mexican counterpart was like, hey, in my country, banks do all the money laundering. And then the Swiss guy's like, yeah, how do you think we got so rich? It was like completely amazing. So bankers, I think, are self-aware about the fact that they are the instrument through which laundering is done. I don't know, but like in the far future, like, or whatever, I just don't see it impacting law enforcement's ability to keep us safe. I think that like large purchases will still require some sort of identification, and that can be done through law in a reasonable social consensus. So in the United States, I will predict that like buying a home, buying a very expensive, for example, weapon, or sending your kid to college and getting a big loan, these things will require some sort of ID, but like day-to-day transactions should be private. And I think there'll be like some sort of social consensus on that like forms organically over time, hopefully. That would be my thought on that. Anyway, thanks guys.
That's amazing. Thank you again, Alex. It's very, very generous of Alex to find the time this afternoon. He's got a lot of events on, I think, while you're at Singularity conference, isn't it? While you're
yeah. So I'm around. I have to go do something now, but people want to hang out later. I'm around.
Sure.
Both
let's do that.
today and tomorrow. So
fantastic.
I know you have like a Telegram group or whatever. So
we do. We'll get you.
I can share it with you. I can share you my Telegram.
Oh, your Telegram. Fantastic.
You can put it into your TG group and
People
can
that
message me.
people that are interested in the little Bitcoin book, I'll be giving out 3 copies to 3 lucky winners tomorrow at the film screening. So if you haven't RSVP'd for the film screening yet, do so now and be in the running for a little Bitcoin book.
That's so exciting. Thank you. Thanks all for your time.
All right, guys. Well, yes. Now, as I said, Alex has got to go, but the rest of us we've still got the use of the space here for as long as we need it. So feel free to hang out and chat. And I might just mention we've got a couple of other events coming up over the next couple of days. There's a movie screening event tomorrow night, Cryptopia, Torsten Hoffman's new film. We've got that one up on the meetup page. And on Wednesday evening, we're having drinks with another guest we've got here, Adam Meister. So he's with us as well. Adam has a very popular YouTube channel. He's been doing that since 2013 and is well known amongst the Bitcoin community across the world. So he's pretty much put his name out. You just spend your time now visiting different meetup groups and different...
Wherever the Bitcoin takes you.
That's the way, yeah. So it's a great way to spend your time. So we'll be having a drinks event with him as well on Wednesday night over at the City Tattersalls Club, where we've had a few of our drinks events before. So that should be a good one. And by the way, stay tuned. We've got our next event here will be the 20th. We're just working on that one, but one way or another, I think it's going to feature. Where's Haas? He was just here a minute ago. Well, it's going to feature Haas one way or another. I think another speaker. We're just working on the finer points of that event, so that'll be put up on the page within the next few days, hopefully. So yeah, guys, thanks for your attention, and let's mingle.